Buenos dias, everyone. This week we're going to be talking about the ethics of care, and this way of thinking about ethics really reframes much of our thinking when it comes to morality and the basic assumptions that we have about how morality works. If you are not a fan of Kant, I have a hunch that you will be a fan of the ethics of care. Now, I'm going to try and keep this video short this week by focusing on the main arguments from Chapter 1, and we'll wait for Chapter 2 and the other perspectives on the ethics of care for a later video. With that being said, let's get into it. Now, philosopher and political theorist Virginia Held begins, as many good philosophers do, with a definition. She says that care is defined as the work involved in caring for people rather than an abstract ideal. Now, from the start, this is not Kantianism, nor is it utilitarianism. Care ethics are focused on concrete human relations and building an ethics from that fundamental understanding instead of digging deep to find some supreme principle of morality or some such nonsense. For Held, care is both a value, something that you strive towards and want to protect and elevate, and it's a practice. It is what you do. And as such, it has 5 distinct features. The first feature of an ethics of care is that it is focused on the compelling moral salience of attending to and meeting the needs of particular others, and those particular others to whom and for whom we are responsible. Instead of saying that we have some kind of abstract ideal of justice or virtue or some principle that we have to align ourselves with, we build our morality on the everyday care that we both give and receive, or fail to give and fail to receive. In other words, this is an ethics that begins from a very real and lived place. To give you some examples, you might think of this as the ethics of parents who think about a world that they know and fear and also love and enjoy, and how they think about that as they send their kids out into it. Or maybe the ethics of children who have become a caregiver to their own parents who might be elderly or struggling with a chronic illness, or even dealing with some kind of substance abuse or addiction. Held makes clear that the ethics of care begins from and highlights caring and being cared for, and the relational ties that bind us all together. It couldn't be further from the other ethical theories that we've covered these past few weeks. And this brings us to the second feature of an ethics of care, the valuing of emotion rather than the rejection of it. For an ethics of care, reason alone is not sufficient for constructing an ethics that addresses the concrete needs of everyday people engaged in caring relationships. Emotions guide and they inform and they enliven and deepen our thoughts, and they can also lead us astray. And this is why Held argues that this is an ethics of care, with limitations and structures in place to use emotions properly rather than just allowing us to have one big feel. Now, the third feature of an ethics of care is that it rejects the idea that the more abstract a theory gets, the more able it is to overcome arbitrariness or bias. Our inclinations and emotions are regarded as something unnatural or insufficient by many moral theories. And the ethics of care says that doesn't necessarily mean that we are able to make sound moral judgments by jettisoning our inclinations or the very particularities that put us in situations requiring care and responsibility. In fact, being attentive to those situations where we have to take particular care and particular responsibility for particular others are exactly the kinds of scenarios that inform our understanding of ethics. In fact, the compelling moral claims of a particular other may be valid even when they're in conflict with the requirements of moral theories. One thinks here, say, of family members of persons who are incarcerated, and how these family members will argue for and advocate for humane treatment of their loved ones even as they are imprisoned and are serving out their sentences. Just because somebody is engaged in some sort of punishment or dealing with a moral consequence does not mean that they are not a person in need of care. And that is precisely what the ethics of care is trying to convey in this feature of it. The ethics of care, in turn, seek to limit the applicability of universal rules of justice and law. Justice and law, in fact, are the kinds of domains where universal laws or universal moral rules might make a lot of sense. But the reality is that it makes a lot less sense to engage in those types of ideals or ethics or morality when we're talking about family members, right? I mean, we have to reckon with the reality that we don't want to be treated equally. We want to be treated ethically. We want to be treated in a manner that's fair relative to the situations we find ourselves in, which sounds quite a bit like Aristotle, and there is some overlap, as Held talks about, but it's something quite different from adherence to a strict moral rule or a principle of happiness or utility. Keeping with this line of thinking, the fourth feature of an ethics of care is that practitioners attempt to reconceptualize our notions of the public and the private. The public domain is traditionally understood as the site of labor or politics or justice, and the private sphere is seen as the site of love, fellowship, and care. But by reconceptualizing what we think about these two domains, we can see that there's plenty of labor in the home and politics at play within relationships, especially when there are different power differentials between the persons involved in those relationships. Building on this reconceptualization of the public and the private, the fifth feature of the ethics of care is that these ethics reconceptualize the idea of personhood beyond liberal individualism and focus on persons as relational, interdependent, moral agents, as opposed to autonomous individuals who use their reason to act within and secure individual rights. Instead, the ethics of care say that, universal rights might not be the be-all, end-all of human existence. Being able to care for and be cared for by others, to whom and for whom one is responsible, well, that sounds a lot more like an ideal worth striving towards based on the world that we live in. Now, as you can see from these features, there is a significant difference between an ethics concerned with justice and one concerned with care. The ethics of justice are focused on ideals such as fairness, equality, individual rights, abstract principles, and the consistent application of all of these things. In many respects, the ethics of justice can be summarized as that ethics which seeks a fair solution between competing interests. With the ethics of care, on the other hand, you have an ethics that is interested in those who are caregivers and those who are cared for as intertwined and non-competing beings. Care's universality, Held argues, means that there's no one who was not at some time cared for, and those relationships mean something. The relationship between a parent and a child, between siblings or friends, these make us think differently about our obligations when we juxtapose them with those kinds of obligations or rights that we see in a justice-based ethical theory. For Held, there can certainly be care without justice, but there can never be justice without care. There can be care even when the rights and agency and dignity of a human is taken from another, and within the very places where we might say injustice can be found. But you can't have justice without the opportunity to care and be cared for. Hence, an ethics of care takes such a different turn from these ethical theories focused on justice. And a big part of this is because it arises out of feminist philosophy. Focusing on the lived realities of women throughout the world has led to the ethics of care formulating its conception of persons, obligation, and action in fundamentally different ways from those philosophies written by dudes at coffee shops. And I think this is an incredibly salient point because it speaks to the ways that many ethical theories presuppose that they are universal when in fact they are far more limited in their ability to be applied in all cases. They are mostly ethics by dudes for dudes about guys just wanting to be dudes or something like that. But Held is clear that the way that the ethics of care thinks about the important parts of moral theories is something new, interesting, and worth examining as we think about our own lives and responsibilities. So, do you think about your obligation to your parents, your family members, your friends, or children differently than you do about, say, your obligation to your classmates or your fellow workers or your professor? Do you think about these relationships as fundamentally a different kind of relationship than, say, those of the people that you work alongside? It might be worth digging into that. And dig we shall in the next video. Thank you so much for watching. Please do the reading, and I will see you next time. Adios.